What if everything we know about ancient history is incomplete? We're taught that civilizations slowly emerge, but what if massive, advanced structures like the pyramids, Yonaguni Monument, and Göbekli Tepe were actually built before that story begins? Think about that for a second. Entire civilizations, sophisticated, powerful, wiped out in a catastrophic event 12,000 years ago. Their existence, their knowledge, almost forgotten, remembered only in myths and puzzling ruins. That's the radical idea championed by Graham Hancock. He has dedicated his life to uncovering the traces of this lost world. Evidence that challenges mainstream archaeology and suggests we are a species with a massive case of collective amnesia. Today we're diving deep into that evidence, the compelling proofs that defy easy explanation. Get ready to have your understanding of the past completely transformed. Welcome to the evidence experts refuse to accept. Imagine diving into the crystal-clear waters off the coast of Yonaguni, the southernmost tip of Japan. As you descend 60, 70, 80 feet below the surface, the blue void begins to take shape. But you aren't looking at a coral reef or a jagged rock formation. Instead, looming out of the darkness is something that looks disturbingly artificial. This is the Yonaguni Monument, a massive, monolithic complex stretching over 150 meters long and 25 meters high. When it was first discovered in 1986 by a local diver looking for hammerhead sharks, it sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Why? Because this structure features perfect 90-degree angles. It has flat, level terraces that look like grand staircases. It has straight edges that run for dozens of meters, and even what appear to be drainage channels and carved symbols. Mainstream geologists will tell you this is natural. They call it archaeological pareidolia, the tendency of the human mind to see patterns where there are none. They argue that the strong currents and the way this specific type of sandstone fractures created these shapes over millions of years. But Graham Hancock asks a question that experts refuse to answer. Since when does nature create a perfect right-angled staircase leading to a flat plaza? Since when does nature carve a giant, weathered face into a rock, or leave behind holes that look exactly like post holes for wooden pillars? If you look at the twin pillars, two massive rectangular blocks standing side by side, it's hard to believe they were shaped by random wave action. And then there's the loop road, a stone path that circles the base of the structure. But here is the most explosive part of the evidence. For this structure to have been built on dry land, we have to go back in time, way back. Sea level analysis shows that the last time the Yonaguni Monument was above water was at least 10,000 years ago, during the last ice age. If this is a man-made temple or a ceremonial platform, it means a civilization capable of massive stone cutting existed at a time when humans were supposed to be nothing more than primitive hunter-gatherers living in caves. Experts refuse to accept it because it breaks their timeline. If Yonaguni is man-made, or even man-finished, meaning humans took a natural rock and shaped it, it proves that an advanced culture was active in the Pacific while the rest of the world was supposedly in the Stone Age. Graham Hancock isn't just looking at a rock. He's looking at a monument to a lost epoch, a place where people once walked, prayed, and perhaps looked out at a horizon that was drowned by the melting ice. The sea didn't just hide this structure, it preserved a secret that mainstream history isn't ready to tell. If there's one place on Earth that keeps mainstream archaeologists awake at night, it is a dusty hilltop in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. For decades, the story of civilization was simple. First, we were hunter-gatherers. Then, we discovered farming. Once we had extra food, we stayed in one place, built cities, and finally we built temples. It was a neat, linear progression. But Göbekli Tepe didn't just break that timeline, it blew it into pieces. This massive complex of T-shaped stone pillars was intentionally buried nearly 12,000 years ago. Let that sink in. This site is twice as old as Stonehenge. It's 7,000 years older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. According to the history books, at this time, humans were supposed to be primitive nomads, struggling just to survive the end of the last ice age. They weren't supposed to know how to organize a workforce of hundreds, or how to move stones weighing up to 20 tons. Yet here they are. When you walk among these pillars, you see incredible high-relief carvings, lions, scorpions, vultures, and strange humanoid figures with belts and handbags. This wasn't a first attempt at architecture. The precision, the artistic detail, and the astronomical alignment suggest a mastery of craft that takes centuries, if not millennia, to develop. Graham Hancock points out a glaring mystery. There is no evidence of evolution at this site. There are no smaller, cruder temples nearby that show how they practiced. It's as if the knowledge to build Göbekli Tepe arrived in a transfer of technology. And then there's the farming. Interestingly, the first evidence of domesticated wheat appears just a few miles from this temple, at the exact same time it was built. This flips the entire human story on its head. It suggests that it wasn't farming that led to religion. It was a massive, organized project to build a temple that forced people to invent farming just to feed the workers. But who were these teachers? Who were these people who appeared at the end of a global cataclysm with the blueprints for civilization already in their hands? Mainstream science calls them hunter-gatherers with a hobby. Hancock calls them survivors of a lost global civilization. He argues that Göbekli Tepe is a time capsule, a message from the past, warning us of the cycles of destruction that Earth goes through. The site was deliberately buried by its creators around 8000 BC. They didn't abandon it, they hid it. They preserved it for us to find today. The question is, are we finally ready to listen to what these stones are trying to tell us? Or will we keep pretending that this impossible temple is just a fluke of history? Every corner of the globe, every ancient culture you can imagine, shares one haunting memory. A story of a world that was washed away. In the Bible, we have Noah. In Mesopotamia, there is Utnapishtim. The Hindus speak of Manu, the Maya tell of a great deluge, and even the indigenous tribes of North America and Australia have oral traditions of the oceans rising to swallow the land. For a long time, mainstream science dismissed these as myths. Simple allegories or local floods exaggerated by time. But what if these aren't just stories? What if they are eyewitness accounts of a global catastrophe? Graham Hancock points to a specific window in time, between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. This is a period geologists call the Younger Dryas. It began with a sudden, mysterious freezing of the planet, and it ended with something even more violent, a rapid, massive rise in sea levels. Scientific data now confirms two massive meltwater pulses during this time. Imagine billions of tons of glacial ice, miles thick, melting almost overnight. The result wouldn't just be a flood. It would be a nightmare of epic proportions. Tsunami waves hundreds of feet high, rain that lasted for weeks, and entire continents changing shape in a matter of days. Think about the geography of our world. Most human civilizations, then and now, are built on coasts. When the sea level rose by 400 feet at the end of the Ice Age, it didn't just flood some fields. It erased millions of square miles of prime real estate. It drowned the coastal plains where an advanced Ice Age civilization would have likely lived. Hancock's argument is chillingly logical. The evidence for a lost civilization isn't missing, it's just 120 feet underwater. The experts refuse to accept the connection because it validates the myths. They've spent a century debunking. But how do you explain over 2,000 different cultures, isolated by oceans, all coming up with the same myth at the exact same point in history? They remembered. They remembered the day the sky fell and the ocean rose. They remembered the 7 sages, or the civilization bringers, who arrived on boats to restart humanity. This wasn't just a flood. It was an extinction-level event that reset the clock for the human race. And as we look at the ruins of Göbekli Tepe, built at the very moment the waters finally stabilized, we have to ask, was that temple a thank you for surviving the wrath of the earth? Or was it a warning for those of us living in the next cycle? When we talk about the Great Pyramid of Giza, we aren't just talking about a pile of stones. We are talking about arguably the most precisely aligned structure on the face of the earth. Mainstream Egyptologists tell us it was built around 2500 BC as a tomb for Pharaoh Khufu. They say it was done using copper chisels, stone hammers, and hemp ropes. But when you look at the raw data, that story begins to crumble. First, let's talk about alignment. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north within 3/60ths of a degree. To give you some perspective, the Meridian building at the Greenwich Observatory in London is only aligned within 9/60ths of a degree. This means a civilization supposedly using primitive tools was more accurate in its engineering than we were in the 18th century. How do you achieve that without advanced surveying equipment? Without lasers? Without a deep understanding of the Earth's rotation? Then there's the scale. The Great Pyramid isn't just a random shape. It is a mathematical map of our planet. If you take the height of the pyramid and multiply it by 43,200, you get the exact polar radius of the Earth. If you take the perimeter of its base and multiply it by the same number, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. Why 43,200? Because that number is a multiple of 72, the number of years it takes for the Earth to move 1 degree in its wobble, known as the precession of the equinoxes. This isn't a coincidence. This is a deliberate, encoded message in stone. It tells us that the builders knew the Earth was a sphere, they knew its dimensions, and they knew its movement through space, thousands of years before the Greeks supposedly discovered these facts. Inside the pyramid, the precision only gets more insane. The king's chamber is made of massive red granite blocks, some weighing up to 80 tons, transported from Aswan, 500 miles away. They are fitted together so perfectly that you can't even slide a credit card between them. These blocks were hoisted at 150 feet into the air and set with sub-millimeter accuracy. Graham Hancock argues that this isn't the work of a young, developing civilization. It is the work of a master class, a legacy of a much older, lost culture that possessed a level of sacred science we are only now beginning to rediscover. Experts refuse to accept this because it implies that the Stone Age wasn't so stone after all. It implies a global project, a shared scientific language, and a purpose far greater than just burying a king. Was the Great Pyramid a tomb, or was it a giant stone book, meant to preserve the most important measurements of our world, for a future that had forgotten its own history? In 1929, inside the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, a discovery was made that should have changed history forever. It was a fragment of a gazelle skin map, drawn in 1513 by a Turkish admiral named Piri Reis. On the surface, it looks like a typical Renaissance-era map. But when you look closer at the bottom edge, you see something that simply shouldn't be there. It shows the coastline of Antarctica. Now, why is that a problem? Because Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820, over 300 years after this map was drawn. But the mystery goes much deeper. Piri Reis wrote in his own notes that he didn't survey the lands himself. He compiled his map from over 20 much older source maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great. In the 1960s, Professor Charles Hapgood of Keene State College took this map to the U.S. Air Force's cartography department. Their conclusion was staggering. The map doesn't just show Antarctica, it shows the Queen Maud Land coast without ice. Think about that for a moment. Modern science tells us that the Antarctic ice sheet is millions of years old. But the Piri Reis map matches the subglacial topography, the actual shape of the land under the ice, which we only mapped in 1958 using seismic sounding equipment. How could anyone in 1513 or even 300 BC know the shape of a continent buried under 2 miles of ice? Graham Hancock argues there's only one logical explanation. The original source maps used by Piri Reis were created by a global seafaring civilization that mapped the world before the ice-covered Antarctica. We are talking about a culture that possessed advanced spherical trigonometry and an understanding of longitude, skills that mainstream history says didn't exist until the late 1700s. Critics and skeptics try to dismiss this. They say it's just a distorted drawing of the South American coast or a lucky guess. But Piri Reis isn't the only one. Other maps, like the Orontius Phineas map of 1531, show the entire continent of Antarctica with rivers and mountains where there is now only frozen wasteland. The experts refuse to accept this because it implies that during the last ice age, while we were supposed to be primitive tribes, someone was already sailing the world's oceans, accurately measuring the planet from pole to pole. If these maps are real, and they are sitting in our museums right now, then we are looking at the literal lost blueprints of a forgotten era. They are the ghosts of a civilization that saw the world as it was 12,000 years ago, a world that we are only just beginning to see again through the lens of modern satellites. One of the most mind-blowing pieces of evidence that Graham Hancock presents isn't a massive monument or a map, it's a collection of symbols. If you travel to ancient Sumer in Mesopotamia, then fly across the ocean to the jungles of Mexico to visit the Aztecs, and finally head to the mysterious temples of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, you'll find something impossible. You will see the exact same image: a mysterious handbag or a small bucket held by gods or spirit beings. In Sumerian carvings, the Anunnaki hold these bags. In Mexico, the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl is depicted with one. And at Göbekli Tepe, carved into stone 12,000 years ago, are 3 of these identical bags. Mainstream archaeologists say it's just a coincidence, perhaps a basket for gathering food. But Hancock asks, why would cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years all choose the exact same, highly specific object to represent their bringers of civilization? He suggests these aren't just bags, they are symbols of office, representing a transfer of technology from a lost parent civilization to the survivors of the Great Flood. But the symbols don't stop at handbags. Think about the serpent. From the pyramids of Giza to the mound builders of North America, the snake is everywhere. It's not just an animal, it's a celestial marker, often representing comets or the movement of the stars. And then there's the number 72. We find it embedded in the myths of Osiris in Egypt, in the temple of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and in the Norse legends of Valhalla. 72 is the key to the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis. Why did every ancient culture obsess over this specific number? Experts refuse to accept this because it suggests a global, sacred science that existed long before our recorded history. They want us to believe these cultures developed in isolation, like bubbles. But when you see the same pinecone symbol being offered by gods in Assyria and carved into the staff of the Pope today, you have to wonder, are we looking at a broken chain of knowledge that once circled the entire planet? Hancock's theory is that after the global cataclysm 12,000 years ago, a few survivors, the sages, or the magicians of the gods, traveled to the primitive tribes that remained. They didn't just give them seeds for farming, they gave them a language of symbols and a blueprint for architecture. They left a breadcrumb trail for us to follow. When you look at these symbols, you aren't just looking at art, you are looking at the remnants of a global operating system, a spiritual and mathematical code that was once understood by everyone, from the Andes to the Nile. We are just the modern students who have forgotten how to read the manual. When we look at the stars today, we see points of light, but to the ancients, the sky was a giant ticking clock, and they were master timekeepers. Mainstream history suggests that advanced astronomy began with the Greeks or the Renaissance. But Graham Hancock presents a staggering counter-argument. Ancient sites across the entire planet are perfectly synced to the stars, not as they look now, but as they looked thousands of years ago. Take Angkor Wat in Cambodia. It is a massive stone representation of the constellation Draco. But here's the catch. It doesn't align with Draco as it appeared when the temple was built in the 12th century. It aligns perfectly with how Draco looked in 10,500 BC. Across the world, at the Giza Plateau, the 3 Great Pyramids are a perfect ground model of Orion's belt. And just like Angkor Wat, they don't match the sky of 2500 BC. They match the specific astronomical alignment of 10,500 BC. Why this specific date? This was the era of the lion, the age of Leo. And what is sitting right next to the pyramids? The Great Sphinx. A giant lion facing due east, looking exactly at its own celestial counterpart, the constellation Leo, as it rose on the horizon on the spring equinox in 10,500 BC. This isn't just stargazing. This is an advanced science called the precession of the equinoxes. The Earth has a slow circular wobble that takes 25,920 years to complete. To even notice this wobble, a civilization needs to keep accurate records for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Yet we find the precessional numbers, like 72, 54, and 108, encoded in the architecture and myths of almost every ancient culture. Experts refuse to accept this. They call it alignment by chance. But how many chances do you get before it becomes a pattern? How did people with supposedly no telescopes or computers calculate the dimensions of the solar system? Hancock argues that these monuments are time capsules. They were built to lock a specific date into the landscape of the Earth using the only clock that never stops, the stars. 10,500 BC was the end of the last ice age, the time of the global cataclysm we discussed earlier. It's as if a lost civilization was trying to send us a message across the millennia. They were saying, this is when it happened. This is when our world ended. They weren't just building temples. They were building a warning system. They understood that the Earth moves in cycles, and by tracking the stars so precisely, they were telling us exactly where we are in the great cycle of time. The question is, are we smart enough to read the clock before it strikes midnight again? When we connect these dots, from the sunken ruins of Japan to the star maps of Giza, a ghost-like image emerges. It's the story of a global advanced civilization wiped out in a heartbeat 12,000 years ago. Mainstream history calls them myths. Graham Hancock calls them our ancestors. Between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, a cosmic cataclysm turned miles of ice into steam, triggering the biblical floods that reset the human clock. Everything they built on the coasts was drowned. Only the stones remained to tell the tale. But here is the real takeaway. These monuments aren't just tombs. They are time capsules. They were built by a civilization that knew the Earth moves in cycles. They encoded their knowledge in stone to warn us that what happened once can happen again. We think we are the pinnacle of progress, but we are just a species with amnesia, waking up in a world of ruins we no longer understand. The evidence is right beneath our feet. The question is, are we brave enough to remember before the cycle repeats?